Well, I took a walk around the world to ease my troubled mind. I left my body.
Now, there's a very specific reason I say science is theology, which is not something that our culture typically will present to us. If I'm studying biology, for example, are you guys sure this isn't too loud? Okay. If I'm studying biology, within the umbrella of biology, I study everything that's related to biology. So biochemistry is a subset of biology. It's all biology. Now, so if God exists, he's the greatest possible umbrella to study. Theology means the study of theos, the Greek word for God. And every single science has the suffix logy to it: physiology, psychology, biology, etc. It's the Greek word for logos, which part of its definition of logos is totality of knowledge, everything that can be said about something. That's why Jesus is called the Logos, right? So if God exists, every aspect of science is a study of God. If, as Christians, we have the historically peculiar bent to look at the world very uniquely. In our materialist culture, in our atheistic culture, especially in the West, the notion is that our minds are simply the product of neurochemistry. So your free will, your consciousness, all that stuff is quite simply an offshoot of matter. Matter came first. Christians believe mind came first. That matter is actually a product of mind and not the other way around. That is a radically different concept that has radically different consequences. Historically, it was in the 13th century under Thomas Aquinas, that the scientific revolution finally took hold, and specifically in the West, specifically in the Christianized West. And there's a very specific reason that happened. If you look at other cultures, the Chinese culture was around for 5,000 years. It had been around for 3,500 years when Europe had started its scientific revolution. Why did they not kickstart the scientific revolution? How come the Aztecs did not? They did science. You know, the African continent did science. The Muslim world did science. Why was it the Christianized? Is it just an accumulation of progressive knowledge that just hit a critical mass point and exploded? That's one theory, and that's probably part of it, to be honest with you. Also, there was a curious difference in even pre-Christian Europe in worldview. Worldviews make a difference. If you study Sumerian creation myths, or Norse creation myths, or Greek creation myths, or First Nations or indigenous creation myths, there's a peculiar difference between their view of the world and that of the Judeo-Christian world. Number one, they see that the world as we see it in Greek and Norse mythology, for example, is literally made by the hands of gods. In some cases, for example, in Norse mythology, the sky is the inside of a dead god's skull, right? Which we clearly know that is not the case. I think that's one worldview we can put behind us in terms of astrophysics. But you see that there was a literal, and then the moods of the gods, including in Muslim theology, the mood of God can change nature itself. So why study something that's very difficult to study if it's not knowable or if it's constantly changing? Okay? The Judeo-Christian worldview in the Old and New Testament, and I'll show you some verses to back that up in a second, saw the world as God built a machine and stepped away. And that machine worked according to a series of laws and functions that didn't change with his mood. Same thing would happen if I built a machine, left it, and walked away. That machine would forever be working according to how I built it. So, and Judeo-Christians believed that we had the image of God somehow as part of our character, that our mind was like a mini version of that of the Creator's. So the universe was knowable because we had a godlike brain, so to speak. And an analogy I like to use is, if you know what a video game is, and you come across a video game and you start playing it, if the level's very hard to get through if it's hard to get through the level, but you know it's a video game, and what are video games designed to do on a certain level? Is it the last level? Especially if you're on level 1. No, you're supposed to be able to figure out how to get through the level and go to the next level. So if you know what a video game is, you're more prone to continue to struggle with it until you crack the code. That's an essential example of why the Judeo-Christian West kept looking for mechanisms and laws that would be knowable to the human mind to crack the code of nature. That's precisely what happened. In the golden era of Greek philosophy, now remember the word philosophy in Plato and Aristotle's time meant what our word for science means today. So when they studied nature, instead of calling it science, they called it the philosophy of nature. The word philosophy in today's dialect conjures up the notion of someone's opinion. My loosely formed opinion is what my personal philosophy is, and you're like, great. To them, it meant the science of logic applied to any subject matter. And math and ethics was the preoccupation of the Greek Golden Era and the pre-Christianized European world, which was also the death of the Greek era and the beginning of the Roman era. All this to say that when I say philosophy, I mean logic or science, right? That's what we would call science today. These tools of science discovered in our 2,000 year obsession with mathematics, which was a abstract concept, was then used 1200s onwards by Thomas Aquinas onwards, and we just aimed that apparatus away from the abstract realm down to nature itself, and it turned out that math, which is an abstract reasoning system, is totally applicable to the realm, which is a clue, which is what we expected as Judeo-Christians, because our minds came before matter, because we have a godlike mind given to us by God, the capital M mind, that created according to its pattern the material realm. Matter is a shadow of the mind that created. Does that make sense? So everyone in this picture here are Christians. If you look at the history of the who's who of about 1,000 years from the scientific revolution till about last century, you see predominantly Christian thinkers. So the notion that Christianity is antithetical to good science is historically completely bunk, right? Even recent history, as I'll show you. And they used to call theology in Christian universities in Europe the queen of all the sciences, right? It was the capstone to all the sciences. Now, why would they call it the queen of all sciences? It was for a specific reason. When you have a university system that studies, what do you have? A math department studying math. You have the psychology department studying the human mind. You have biology, you have physics, you have different departments within your university. Now you're studying the same world. You're not studying another dimension in one side of the university and studying this dimension over on the west wing. You're studying the same world. So your overarching worldview should thread all of that together in a logically coherent way. Theology, Christian theology, compared to the modern Western university, which is usually always capstoned with what? Atheistic materialism. That is the new sort of worldview that's imbibed into every major Western university. Now there's a problem with that as far as I'm concerned. If I'm in a math department studying, where's the number one, where's the number two? Where are numbers in the real world? They don't exist. Okay, logic is an abstract but real concept. And again, most thinkers throughout history have paid homage, including Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, to the fact that reasoning proves that there is an immaterial, or what they call a metaphysical aspect to reality. They too saw mind as precursor to matter, not the other way around. So if I'm studying math for my degree, I'm spending all day, every day for 4 years studying something that doesn't exist in the real world, in the physical world, but is totally true. That runs as a direct cognitively dissonant contradiction if my university proclaims that the world is an atheistic system, right? Or if I go to the biology department and I study that living organisms are literally have micro machines inside of them that read and copy DNA information blueprints to build proteins and build my body. You could say that is more explicable in a created worldview, a real worldview that has an intelligent designer on top of it. So they believed in the Christian West in the last 1,000 years that the most logical worldview to capstone all that was happening under a university's roof was theology. Now, if you look at the last century's Nobel Prize winners, the predominant worldview amongst them was Christian. Can you guys see those numbers up there? 65.4% of all the last century's Nobel Prize winners were Christians. So the question is there an inherent problem between Christianity and science, right? 78.3% of peace prizes, Nobel Peace Prizes, were won by Christians. 72.5% of chemistry Nobel Prizes were won by Christians. 65.3% in physics, 62% in medicine, 54% in economics, and 49% in the realm of literature. So there's an intellectual, at least an intellectual, there's no intellectual hindrance because we're the number one most represented subgroup. And if you add in there the Jewish realm, that rounds out the Judeo-Christian group, grows that number even larger. Now, the American Association for the Advancement of Science is the world's largest professional scientific organization, even though it's called the American Association. Basically, if you're a professional scientist, let's say you're a chemical engineer working for Dow Chemical, or you're a physician in a rural practice, if you have a scientific job and scientific training and you have a professional scientific license, you can belong to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, in 2009, Pew Research did a breakdown of their membership and their worldview. And this is a worldwide study. So if you look on there, if you include Jewish, Catholic, mainline Protestant, evangelical, and other religion, which involves miscellaneous religions and Hinduism, etc., 48% of the professional scientists on Earth are spiritual in their beliefs. Now, 4% didn't respond. That means there's 48% of the pie on the other side. Now, on the other side, the numbers on below, in blue, 20% just didn't think through. They're like, I don't know. I don't know what I believe, right? They're not atheists. They're just undecided. And I don't know why they split nothing in particular pie from the agnostic pie, because agnostic means I don't know, right? So 31% doesn't know, hasn't thought it through, or doesn't want to say, and only 17% would identify themselves as committed atheists. So atheism is a minority group within the... Now, it's different to look at the professional scientific world and then to go and do a survey of university professors, okay? I went to UVic, I went to U of A, and I went to a school in Southern Cal. All my teachers would, most of the time back in those days, a long time ago, wouldn't really explicitly say what they believed, but you could get a feel that most of them were probably atheistic in their orientation, in biology anyways. So what you're seeing there is that there is in media and in professorships, there is a higher percentage of atheism, at least outward atheism, because try being a Christian in a university in the West, it could cause some problems to your career. But in the realm of actual professional working scientists who are getting results, including Nobel Prize winners, it's the other side. The story flips around. It's predominantly Judeo-Christian. Those are the statistics. Now, I want to show you a tale of two scientists. This is Charles Darwin, and he published in 1859, he published on the origin of the species. And he gave an atheistic creation story, so to speak, in trying to come up with a biological theory that would explain the spontaneous creation of different species without any intelligent design having to be involved. And a combination of mutations with natural selection was his basic mechanism. Now, a very interesting thing to remember about his theory in his time. This is the 1850s. How many of you would want to sign up for a medical practice that was done in the 1850s and had not been reviewed by now? Right? Most of the time, the answer is a no thank you. In Charles Darwin's time, the microscopes were so weak compared to the electron microscope that they thought the individual cell that makes up our bodies was what they called a homogeneous gelatinous unit, which means essentially a piece of Jell-O. And the reason that if you cross-hybridize, let's say, a red rose with a white rose, you sometimes get a pink rose, is they didn't know what genetics were, and they thought it's kind of like mixing paint, right? I take a little bit of, like Bob Ross, take a little bit of this red paint and then maybe a little white paint, and now we got a little pink flower, right? That's how they thought. They legitimately thought that's how it worked. And again, if we had been around in those days, we would have been right there with them, right? We could laugh all we want, but we would have been there like, yeah, that's how it works. But when he died, they found in his desk an unopened letter from a gentleman named Gregor Mendel. Guys ever heard the term Mendelian genetics? Right? Gregor Mendel was a botanist, chemist, and priest, and he had begun to crack the code to modern genetics. So these charts, everyone's seen these charts in high school, right? Those are Mendelian genetic charts. And he's saying, no, it's not like mixing paint. It's mixing genetics. The male plant gives some sort of information to the female plant, and both of them combine, and some genes are recessive. In other words, if you combine usually blue-eyed genes are recessive, which means if your dad gives you blue-eyed genes, but your mom gave you brown-eyed genes, most of the time, like 98% of the time, the brown-eyed gene is dominant, so you'll end up with brown eyes. You have to have two blue-eyed genes, both for mom and dad, because they're weak recessive genes, to have actual blue eyes. Things like that. So the interesting thing is what here? Who was more correct? The atheist scientist or the theistic scientist? And did Gregor Mendel use Christianity to come up with his observations? Well, no. He used his science, his straight science. So my point is, science and Christianity are by no means incompatible or in any way in competition with each other. Albert Einstein, in 1905 and 1915, he published two works, the Special Theory of Relativity and the General Theory of Relativity. Now, in his math, he saw that if you look at the history of the universe, it seems to be winding down in the past. So, in other words, there's a t=0 moment in our past, a point at which time did not exist. So the physical universe seems to have come out of a time before which it did not exist. Now, 100 plus years ago, the current theory at any given university in the West was what's called the static model of the universe. Basically what it means is the universe was eternal. It had always existed, it had never begun to exist. It was just the base membrane of reality. It was the only thing that's ever existed. That was the legitimate worldview of Albert Einstein. So what did Albert Einstein do? He put into his math basically an equation, a formula called the cosmological constant. And what that did is it kept his math from revving down to t=0 in the past. It kept the age of the universe as steady and eternal. As soon as he published it, he was criticized in the literature by other scientists. They're saying, why did you mess with your math? And he goes, well, it was an honest mistake. He goes, well, because we know that has to be the reality. And then there's starting to be a buzz in the physics world of like, maybe the math is right, and maybe we got to review our theory in light of the math. Now, about 10 years after Einstein, in 1927, a little-known Jesuit priest / astrophysicist, you see a lot of that in the old school days. We produced theologians and cutting-edge scientists in universities, which is something we should aim to do once again, by the way. He published a work, the first published work, to promote what we now currently call the Big Bang cosmological theory. Again, he used math untouched by his personal biases as a Christian that turned out to be what? Turned out to be correct. There was, whether you believe in an old universe or a young universe, the theory of the Big Bang is the current king of theories, which for the longest time was rejected by academia because they said this looks a lot like what? Like Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. They accused people like George to have been theologically biased in their decision making. And he's like, well, just look at my math. Long story short, there was a time before which the physical universe did not exist, which is now the current view, which always, you can read it in the literature. I used to be subscribed to the Scientific American magazine, and every time they talk about the Big Bang, you can sense behind their discussion that they're not comfortable with it. There's just something about the beginning of everything from nothing that makes a materialist uncomfortable. So Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, and the wording here is very important in the Hebrew. The term that used for in the beginning in the original Hebrew means like the chief beginning, like capital T, capital B beginning. And the word created is bara, which is a unique Hebrew word that means from nothing. Out of absolutely no pre-existing material, which again is completely unique to the Judeo-Christian creation myth, creation story. I don't think it's a myth. If you compare it to Norse mythology, Sumerian mythology, there's always something before that even births a god himself. There's always a pre-existing proto-matter from which things come to be, which is very similar to the former atheistic world of 100 years ago, who believed that proto-matter was the universe. It was very pagan. Christianity does stand alone, Judeo-Christianity does stand alone as a stark, different type of creation story. And created from nothing, created what? The heavens and the earth, which is basically what we call the cosmos. Because in those days, the earth was everything you could see down here, and the heavens was everything out there, right? So the opening line of the Bible, against all odds, 100 years ago, turned out to be vindicated by science. Now, why is it that the Christians are peculiarly bent on seeing a mechanism behind creation? If you look at Proverbs 3:19, the Lord founded the earth by wisdom, and he established the heavens with understanding. Those basically in the Hebrew wording make the words we would use nowadays as laws. Did he use his own hands, like in Greek and Norse and Sumerian and in indigenous mythology, literally building stuff with his hands? No. He literally put forth laws, and this is in the Old Testament, with which to develop the heavens and the earth, which is precisely what we found to be true by studying the heavens and the earth. There's many examples of this. I'll give you one last one, Jeremiah 10:12. He founded the world by his wisdom and stretched out the heavens by his understanding. And the term stretched out of the heavens is interesting because we live in an expanding universe, right? Just a side point. So we expected to see order as the source of how things work, and that's precisely what we found. In physics, we have what's called constants, or the laws of how the world works. Now, there's 61 of them that we know of today. There's probably more, because we used to only have 23, but there's at least 61 constants that have to be perfectly balanced for our world to work the way that it works. Now, this is true not only of here, but this would be true of on the other side of the universe, which is why they're called physics constants. All of material reality, everywhere in the visible universe, must obey this uniform physical laws, or else everything breaks down. As an example, the strength of gravity, okay, and it's very precisely calculated, the Newtonian constant. If that were to change by a fraction, what would actually happen? There would be a ricocheting of events that would be out of sync, because right now, all 61 laws are perfectly jiving together. It'd be like gears perfectly attuned to each other. What happens when you take one part of a working machine and jerry-rig it? You mess with the whole system. There's ricocheting problems. Another constant would be the speed of light in an absolute vacuum. Again, very precisely measured, and the error, we've never really observed any error margins on these except for like in the trillionth of degrees, right? Like it's absolutely, that's why we call them constants. It's as close to consistency as we found in our reality. The size and mass of protons, neutrons, electrons, not only individually, but in relation to each other, as well as their charge. You mess with that within a tiny minutia, and theoretically, everything would break down. Now we don't know because we have no power to change them. But the idea that you could play with these precision modules and not have catastrophe does go against most of what has been determined throughout reality. So here's the list of the 61 constants. Okay, so life, my point is this, by the way, even just matter, like 75% of all the matter in the universe is hydrogen. Just a single proton, one electron, no neutron. That's 75% of material reality. Most of the space is empty vacuum. There's dark matter and stuff like that, but even the stuff that's out there, just a piece of matter is precisely, it's not like stuff is dumb and simple. Even just simple matter is precisely on a knife's edge of calibration, which is interesting, right? That's not the kind of universe I would conceive of or expect if this was a purely accidental world. Not one that runs on, it's almost like a clue. And it says in Romans 1:21 that we can know some of God's attributes by studying the things that he has made. What are his attributes? Intelligence, precision, stability, all these things. Another reason why I see science as theology. You learn about what he has done, you get a glimpse into his character. That isn't necessarily something we would know from experience. Now, a common theme in media, science fiction, education, in our world is that life is not life on Earth or a planet like Earth. There's probably tons of them out there. I mean, some of my favorite movies basically say this, like Star Wars, etc. Is that actually true? Well, there will be some issues to consider before we think that there's just life like a planet like Earth is common. So, what's one of the main prerequisites for complex life on any planet? Water. Now, it can't be locked up in a frozen tundra. It has to be in liquid and gaseous form. Now, what has to happen to a planet for it to have water, right? It has to be in what's called the habitable zone, which is a certain distance from a star that it's orbiting. Now, it's precise to some degree because if we were 5% closer to the sun, we'd have all water would be vaporized. There would be no life on Earth. And if we were too far away from the sun, everything would be frozen. So we just happen to be the exact right distance from the sun. Size of our crust. What has to happen? By the way, when was plate tectonics first discovered? When was it first accepted by the geological realm? The 1960s. It was a minority view within geology that the Earth's crust was moving like a carpet, and at fault lines, it would dip back into the magma, get melted, and then on the other side of the tectonic plate, the continental plate, new fresh crust was coming up from the magma. That rotating belt of destroying and rebuilding crusts is how we replenish nutrients in our crust to allow for life. Now, if the crust was too thick, it wouldn't be able to be broken down at a fast enough rate. If it was too thin, we'd all be, the floor is lava game we used to always play. That would be life always, and there would be no life, right? So there's very precise things that need to happen. Planet size. If we have too small of a planet, the magma has to have a certain heat and content inside the core of a planet to give off a magnetic field. Now, what do we need a magnetic field for? It's a shield to protect against solar radiation, which is constantly belching out at us. It would kill every last bit of life. If that's one of the problems with going to Mars, by the way, is not getting radiation poisoning by the time you get to Mars because you're outside the Earth's magnetic field. So the Earth's magnetic field its size and strength is a direct proportion to its size. The size and strength of the magnetic field is directly proportionate to the size of the ball of magma inside underneath our crust. Now, I'm assuming it could be somewhat bigger, but we need it to be at least a certain size for us to survive. Oxygen-nitrogen ratio in the atmosphere. It has to be just right to have an ozone layer to protect from radiation as well, but it also has to be there for cellular respiration for complex life. So again, atmosphere is in a perfect proportion. Size of our moon. We have an exceptionally large moon for our size of a planet. Have you seen Jupiter's moons? Right? They're tiny little beads around a gas giant. Whereas we have a moon that's a quarter of our size, which, by the way, it's impossible for us. Our orbital field isn't strong enough to capture something that size as it floats by. So there's a real mystery in astrophysics as to how the heck we have such a large moon at a perfect distance from us that it doesn't run into us and collapse, and it doesn't run away from us. Because what's one of the main functions the moon does to promote life on Earth? Not the tides, although that is part of it. It is the stabilizing of our axis at 23.5 degrees. It's tilted just enough on Earth that as we rotate, and we go around the sun in that rotation, we have different seasons. But they don't vary so darn much that everything dies. But it does allow a churning of the ecosystem in a just right fashion. But if we had less of a tilt, we'd have no life on Earth. Interesting. And we need a moon of precisely that size to stabilize us. Now, sun. We need a specific type of sun. Our sun, if you want to impress people at your next cocktail party, we have a spectral type G2 yellow dwarf main sequence star. Actually, come to think of it, that would make you unpopular at the next party. Don't say that. It's larger than 90% of our stars in our galaxy, in the Milky Way galaxy, as far as we can tell. Okay? It's larger than 9 out of 10 other stars. It's a fairly large star. It's not the largest, as we'll see in our video, but it has to be at least that size because it has to give us enough heat that we have to be far enough away from it to get that heat. Because if the sun was smaller, in order to stay within its orbit, we'd have to be, and within its habitable zone of warmth, we'd actually have to be closer to it. Now, what would that do? That would be intensified gravity, which would have us synchronize our orbit like the moon is to us. What I mean by this is it would get to the point where we would always have the same side of our Earth facing the sun every single time. One Earth rotation would take a whole year, just like the moon's rotation takes a month on itself, which happens to be the exact length of its orbit around us. So we always see the same face on the moon. The other side of the moon is on the other side. Now, luckily for the moon, when we have a new moon, we don't see the moon, while the moon's dark side is actually facing the sun. Half the month, the moon gets sun on its other. But if we have no sun behind us, which we don't, we'd have a perpetual dark side to our planet, which would kill all life. You can't have that. So these factors are, and that's just some of them. We have to be at the right location in our galaxy. It would have to be in a spiral galaxy, by the way, because some galaxies are just a cloud of stars, where it's a uniform amount of radiation all the way around, would destroy life on Earth. If we're outside, you see the Milky Way has those spiraling arms. We're not in that. We're outside of that. If we were in it, we'd be dead from radiation. So, right size planet, right size moon, right size star, right location in the galaxy are just some. We have to have the right-sized gas giants, because gas giants do what as they orbit around the sun? There are huge pockets of gravity that suck in meteorites and asteroids, protecting us. Otherwise, we'd have a higher rate of meteor impact, which could be deadly. Okay? So they actually did an equation. They took in all factors, some of which I haven't named tonight. So what are the chances of a planet like Earth existing in our own Milky Way? And the number is, quite literally, 1 in a quadrillion. Okay? That's a huge number. That's it's 0 point something percent chances. You'd have, if you want to put it in percentage points, you'd have 13 zeros. Okay? We're talking about, to give you a more stark example, how many stars are there in our galaxy, the Milky Way, approximately? About 100,000 million, which is this number right there. That means there's 10,000 times too few stars for probabilities to deliver one planet Earth, according to our best guess. Very interesting. So is Earth a commonplace pebble? Like if you go to Ross Bay Beach, there's nice rocks, but they're everywhere. They're common. If you find a baby in the Sahara Desert, it's an uncommon thing. It's a precious thing, right? So is Earth a precious gem, or is it a common, regular, run-of-the-mill thing? Well, the science seems to say it's extremely unlikely, if not impossible, for us to be here. So I want to look at this verse, and I'm going to show you a couple of videos, then we're going to open it up to question and answer. Sometimes you read a verse and you're like, I mean, I do it all the time. You read a verse, you're like, yeah, next verse. Sometimes, though, the reason I like to study science is, and the reason I think science is theology, is when you delve into the science aspect of something, of this world, it pumps up your theology. And let's see if this verse comes more alive to us at the end of the presentation than right now. The heavens tell the glory of God, and their expanse declares the work of his hands. What does it mean by the glory of God? It makes you go, wow. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Now, the verse 2 and 3 on there, how does the heavens pour forth speech? We look at the night sky with our super telescopes, and we start to, with these photosensitive lenses, and we start getting what from outer space? Information. We start to see faraway galaxies, things that we wouldn't see with the naked eye. Literally, in a very real way, the heavens are pouring forth data at us. The Aztecs by looking at the star, it's one of the first established sciences, by the way, that was universally worldwide practice, was astronomy. Because, we think of the ancient people with their feather hats and their loincloths as dumb, but the reality is they had sophisticated math and observations. So, for example, the Aztecs, by looking at the movement of the stars, came up with a 365-day calendar. So did the Romans, and there was no astronomy conference in those days, and there was no internet. They had no connection with each other, and they were hundreds of years apart in their observations. But they came up with the same by doing what? Looking at the speech coming from the heavens in terms of data. Now, I'm going to show you 4 videos, then we'll be done. These videos will pump up that first verse. The heavens tell of the glory of God. Next video is a representation of the complexity, how precariously protected we are. We should all be mutated, cancerous, and dead. That's how much radiation's coming in from outer space, right? And there's a very thin zone of protection that we have. So just to scare you a little bit, let's see the next video.
As the Earth rotates over 24 hours, the planet responds to the extraordinary power of the sun. Each day, 170 million gigawatts, over 7,000 times the power that humanity consumes, rains down on the surface, triggering a wave of activity that never ceases. At dawn, plants and plankton begin to photosynthesize, using the light to make sugars and starches, the basis of the food chain. The power source for almost all living things. Sunlight drives wind and weather around the globe. When the air cools at night, it triggers much of the Earth's rainfall. We are part of this circadian pattern too, built to respond to the daily influx of energy from above. The cells in our bodies need sunlight to create vitamins in our skin. flight paths of planes reveal our intimate relationship with the sun. Aircraft travel westwards in the morning to extend the day, and eastwards in the evening to reduce the night. But ironically, the biggest threat to this finely balanced arrangement is from the same thing that allows it to exist in the first place. The energy given off by the sun. The SDO satellite records the ultraviolet radiation released by our star. Charged particles, fractions of atoms, protons, electrons, and neutrons are constantly thrown out, along with massive pulses of electromagnetic radiation. But occasionally, the sun throws out what's known as a coronal mass ejection. This supercomputer visualization shows a cloud of plasma millions of kilometers wide, racing towards the Earth. If these solar particles were free to hit the Earth's surface, they would do serious damage to any living thing, producing fatal mutations in their DNA. Fortunately, the Earth has a defense. An invisible force field called the magnetosphere surrounds our planet, visualized here in unprecedented detail. These images are generated by data from 5 magnetically tuned satellites. Called Themis, the network of spacecraft reveals the force field as it is constantly bombarded by the sun. The shape of the field is produced by the sheer force of the radiation hitting it. A nebulous teardrop 200,000 miles in diameter. As wave upon wave of solar particles strike the magnetosphere, most are deflected. But when a coronal mass ejection arrives, the charged particles peel open the magnetic field's outer layer. Particles are now free to rush in towards the planet. The Earth's inner magnetic field steers the radiation towards the poles, triggering one of nature's most remarkable sights. The northern and the southern lights. Here, we can see the Earth's second layer of defense. Giant ribbons of plasma stream downwards, encircling both the North and South poles.
You can test your friend's IQ points next time you see a Northern Lights display. They should be screaming and going like this. Ah! If they're going, wow, you know they're an idiot. No. Final video, it's only a couple minutes long. This just to appreciate the size comparisons out there in the heavens and the earth. that, let's review that one verse. The heavens tell of the glory of God, and their expanse declares the work of his hands. Seem a little more palpably true to you? A little more of a wow factor, right? That's in what science is good for. Pump up our theology. Any questions or answers? You may have a question I don't have an answer for. Yes, and Blaze, can I get you to... We'll have the mic passed around or else he can't hear you on the live stream. Thank you. Yeah.
So, if God only exists in our universe, how does that explain the multiverse?
Well, no, I mean, the multiverse, this video was secular, so I'm not saying I believe in the multiverse necessarily, but even if there was a multiverse, if mind precedes matter, right, and the ultimate mind is God, then God would be the author of all physical reality.
Then would that dictate that all universes inside the multiverse follow the same set of rules?
I don't know. I've never been to another universe. All I can tell you is what this universe is like, right?
True that.
Nobody's got questions? Comments too? Comments too?
We're discussing mind. The mind is creating matter. So in a quantum realm, then, as far as what we're perceiving, visualizing, manifesting, how would that relate to a Christian?
Yeah, the idea is that the quantum reality doesn't follow specific laws. It's totally chaotic. Is that what you mean? Yeah. Well, the funny thing about that's a theory, because quantum reality is basically on such a small level we're barely studying it and seeing it. We can observe it and it seems to follow no rules. The curious thing is, if everything's made up of quantum reality and everything is extremely stable and regular like clockwork, maybe we just don't understand quantum reality, right? Just like the Copernican principle, when Copernicus essentially proved that Earth was not the center of reality, and that we actually moved around a star, and there were several other stars like that. During the Enlightenment era, people got used to using what they call the Copernican principle to say, we're not really special. We thought we were the center of the universe. We're just a rock going around a star, and there's lots of them. So the Copernican principle was misunderstood to be anti-Christian or dethroned us from our position in the universe, right? When it turns out that I don't agree with that. Just because we're on a rock in a huge, magnificent system that's clearly like, we looked at the physical constants, this universe isn't hodgepodge, it's carefully knife-edged balance on a set of physical laws. In the same way, I've never understood people's fascination with using quantum mechanics to say that this world is chaotic. This world is anything but chaotic. Sure, when I look at the smallest possible chunk of reality, which we're barely kissing and understanding, it may look chaotic, but if everything's based off of it, how could it be chaotic? Because everything it makes, atoms, protons, is incredibly structured, balanced, and stable. You see what I mean? It's a lack of understanding, is what I think. And I don't understand why people don't see that. It's like, if the basement membrane of reality was chaotic, then the rest of reality would be chaotic, and it isn't. No more questions? Comments? Insights? All right, well, let's wrap it up. We're back here in 2 weeks, for those of you who are interested, for another Science is Theology installment. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Thanks.
I'm coming home, tell the world I'm coming.